It wasn't just a tear. It was a jagged, deliberate slash across the pale blue silk, meant to break her spirit before she even stepped out of the carriage. Her stepmother wanted her humiliated, a walking cautionary tale of what happens when the unwanted orphan tries to play among the elite. She expected tears. She expected a quiet, shameful retreat. What she didn't expect was that when the girl walked into the ballroom, wearing ruin-like armor, the Duke of Westmoreland would stand up. The sewing room smelled of scorching linen and stale lavender. Beatrice Linfield sat by the window, catching the last, bruised light of the afternoon on the tip of her needle. Her thumb was a map of tiny, rusted pricks. Across the room, the rustle of imported French silk sounded like a sudden downpour. "The waist is still entirely too loose, Beatrice," Harriet complained, turning sideways in front of the mirror. She sucked in her stomach, though there was nothing to hide. If the Duke of Westmoreland wanted a woman shaped like a loaf of bread, he would marry his baker. Cecily snickered from the velvet chaise, popping a candied violet into her mouth. "Westmoreland doesn't want a woman at all, from what I hear. He wants a brood mare with a flawless pedigree." "Which means," she paused, shooting a glance at Beatrice's bent head, "he'll be looking entirely at us." Beatrice didn't look up. She bit off the end of the thread, the cotton dry and tasteless against her tongue. "Take it off, Harriet. I will take the seams in another quarter-inch." Lady Agatha Linfield drifted into the room then. She moved quietly for a woman of her consequence, like cold air seeping under a doorframe. She didn't look at her stepdaughter immediately. She inspected Harriet's bodice, adjusted a ribbon on Cecily's shoulder, and only then let her gaze drop to the girl in the corner. "You're working slowly today, Beatrice," Agatha said. Her voice was mild, thoroughly reasonable. It was the tone she used right before she did something devastating. "The silk is delicate, stepmother. I didn't want it to pucker." "Commendable." Agatha smoothed her own immaculate skirts. "The carriage leaves at 8. I expect the girls to be flawless. Westmoreland's ball is the apex of the season. He is finally choosing a bride. And I will not have a single frayed thread marring my daughter's chances." Beatrice laid the gown across her lap. She kept her eyes on the pale pink fabric. "I have finished my own chores for the week. The accounts are balanced. The pantry is inventoried." She took a slow, shallow breath. "I would like to attend tonight." Silence dropped over the room, heavy and absolute. Cecily stopped chewing. Harriet turned from the mirror, her mouth slightly open. Agatha didn't laugh. That wasn't her way. She merely tilted her head, observing Beatrice as one might observe a dog trying to walk on its hind legs. Amusing, but ultimately unnatural. "You wish to attend the Duke's ball?" "Yes." "You have not been formally introduced to society." "I am 23, stepmother. I am past the age of needing a formal debut." "My father..." The words caught, jagged in her throat. She swallowed them down. "My father intended for me to go." Agatha's eyes went flat. Mentioning the late Viscount was a misstep. But Beatrice was tired. She was tired of the sewing room, tired of the dust, tired of being a ghost in the house she was born in. Agatha smiled. It didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, if it was your father's wish. Far be it from me to deny you society. You may come." Harriet gasped. "Mother!" Agatha raised a single gloved hand. Harriet snapped her mouth shut. "However, Beatrice, you know our funds are stretched. There is no money for a new gown. You will have to wear something from the attic trunks. Your mother's things, perhaps." "Thank you," Beatrice said, keeping her voice entirely neutral. "I will have a maid bring the trunk to your room," Agatha said. Do not be late." An hour later, Beatrice stood in her small, drafty bedroom under the eaves. A leather trunk sat on the floor, its lock broken. She knelt and threw back the lid. The smell of camphor and old rosewater drifted up. She lifted the tissue paper. Beneath it lay a gown of ice-blue silk, overlaid with silver netting. It was the dress her mother had worn to a royal pavilion 15 years ago. Beatrice pulled it out. The fabric was limp, but worse than the age was the damage. A massive, jagged slash ran from the left hip down to the knee, the silk severed cleanly by what could only be tailor's shears. The delicate silver netting at the hem was shredded, hanging in sad, uneven clumps. Large, undeniable rust stains bloomed across the back of the bodice. This was no accident of time. This was an execution. Agatha hadn't sent a maid to fetch the trunk. She had gone herself. Beatrice stared at the ruined dress. Her hands began to shake, a fine, violent tremor that started in her wrists and moved to her shoulders. She dropped the dress onto her narrow bed. She understood the game perfectly. Agatha knew Beatrice had pride. If Beatrice saw the dress and chose to stay home, Agatha won. She would have broken Beatrice's rebellion without lifting a finger in public, leaving the girl to sit in the dark, thoroughly reminded of her place. If Beatrice wore the dress, she would be annihilated. The Ton did not forgive poverty, but they actively punished audacity. Showing up in rags was an insult to the host. She would be laughed out of the ballroom, her reputation reduced to ash. Beatrice sat on the edge of the mattress. She looked at the jagged slash in the silk. It looked like a wound. "Don't cry," she told herself. "Tears change nothing." She looked at her hands, the calluses, the needle pricks. She had spent 5 years making sure Agatha and her daughters looked perfect. She knew how garments were constructed. She knew how they fell apart. She stood up. She opened her own small sewing box. She did not have time to make it perfect. She did not have matching thread, nor extra silk to patch the hole. The ruin could not be hidden. So, she wouldn't hide it. She took a thick white petticoat and pinned it firmly beneath the slash, so that when the blue silk parted, it showed stark, clean white rather than her leg. She took her needle and rapidly whip-stitched the frayed edges of the tear with dark navy thread, not to blend in, but to stop the unraveling. The thick, dark stitches looked like surgical sutures across the pale blue. She tore away the shredded silver netting at the hem entirely, leaving the bottom edge raw but even. When she put it on, she looked in the cracked mirror above her washstand. She didn't look like a princess. She looked like a casualty of war. The dress was a scarred, stitched-together monstrosity. It screamed of neglect and desperate, ugly mending. Beatrice pinned her dark hair up in a severe, simple knot without a single jewel or ribbon. She pinched her cheeks until they held a faint flush of color, masking the dead pallor of her fear. She walked downstairs. The carriage was already gone. Agatha hadn't even waited. Beatrice paid for a hired hackney with 3 silver shillings she had kept hidden in a loose floorboard for over a year. She climbed inside the carriage, smelling stale gin and damp hay, and stared straight ahead into the London night. Aylesbury House did not merely occupy space in Mayfair. It dominated it. The massive stone facade was lit by hundreds of flambeaux, the orange light flickering against the polished carriages lining the street. Beatrice stepped out of the hackney. The driver didn't offer a hand. He just looked at her, then at the sprawling mansion, and spat into the gutter. "Good luck to you, miss. Look like you'll need it." She didn't reply. She joined the end of the line of arrivals. The physical sensation of being out of place was immediate and suffocating. Ahead of her were women wrapped in velvet cloaks trimmed with ermine, men in immaculate evening dress. The air smelled of expensive cigars, crushed orchids, and rain. Beatrice wore a faded wool shawl over her mutilated dress. As she reached the grand portico, the liveried footman held out his white-gloved hand for her invitation. He did not look at her face. He looked at the edge of her raw silk hem, brushing the marble stairs. His hand hesitated. Beatrice shoved the thick cardstock into his hand. "Miss Beatrice Linfield," she said. Her voice sounded thin, stretched tight. The footman passed the card to the majordomo. The majordomo, an older man with eyes like flint, looked Beatrice up and down. He saw the dark, heavy stitches holding the slashed hip together. He saw the frayed edges. For a fraction of a second, Beatrice saw him debate, turning her away. He was calculating the risk of throwing out a guest against the risk of letting a beggar into the Duke's house. But the invitation bore the Linfield seal, and it was authentic. He offered a curt, sharp nod and gestured toward the grand staircase. Beatrice stepped inside. The foyer was a cavern of white marble and gold leaf. A massive crystal chandelier hung overhead, casting a harsh, brilliant light that forgave nothing. The staircase curved upward toward the ballroom, the steps lined with ferns and white roses. Beatrice took the first step. She slipped off her wool shawl and handed it to a bewildered maid. The moment the gown was fully exposed, the temperature in the foyer seemed to drop. It started with a woman in emerald green near the base of the stairs. She was mid-laugh, her fan fluttering, when her eyes caught Beatrice. The laugh died instantly. The fan stopped. She tapped the arm of the gentleman beside her. He turned. His eyebrows shot up toward his hairline. Beatrice kept her chin parallel to the floor. She took the second step, one foot in front of the other. Lock the knee. Breathe. The silence rippled upward, an invisible wave washing over the crowd. Conversation snapped shut. Heads turned. It wasn't the silence of awe. It was the sharp, predatory silence of a pack of hounds catching a scent of blood. Then the murmurs began. They weren't quiet. The ton rarely bothered to hide their disdain from someone they deemed beneath them. Good God, is that a prank? Look at the stitching. It looks like a ship's sail. Did she crawl out of a ditch on her way here? Who is she? Beatrice took the third step. The fourth. Her pulse beat a frantic, hollow rhythm against her ribs. It tasted like copper in the back of her throat. The heat of 100 stairs burned into her skin. She could feel the exact location of the slashed silk on her hip, the heavy navy thread feeling like lead weights pulling her down. Halfway up the stairs, she saw them. Agatha, Harriet, and Cecily were standing on the upper landing, near the ballroom entrance. Harriet was clutching her mother's arm, her mouth an O of manufactured horror. Cecily was pressing a handkerchief to her lips, shaking with suppressed laughter. Agatha just watched. Her expression was perfectly neutral, but her eyes were bright, hard, and triumphant. "Look at you," those eyes said. "Look at what you are." Beatrice's steps faltered. For 3 seconds, she froze on the stairs. Flight instinct screamed at her. She could turn around. She could run down the stairs, back into the dark, back to the sewing room. She would be safe. Broken, but safe. She looked at Agatha's triumphant face. No, Beatrice's jaw tightened. The fear didn't leave her, but it calcified. It hardened into a cold, dense rage. She would not let them erase her. If they wanted to look at her, let them look. She would not hide her ruin. She resumed her climb. Her pace was slow, deliberate. She did not rush. She did not look at her feet. She looked straight ahead. She reached the top landing. The majordomo at the ballroom doors held her card. He looked at her, then at the vast, glittering room beyond. He cleared his throat. It sounded loud in the sudden, tense quiet. "Miss Beatrice Linfield." His voice rang out, echoing off the vaulted ceilings. The grand double doors were already open. Beatrice stepped over the threshold and walked into the lion's den. Charles Parker, the Duke of Westmoreland, was bored. It wasn't a fleeting, polite boredom. It was a deep, bone-aching exhaustion with the performative circus of his own life. He sat in a high-backed velvet chair near the orchestra alcove, a glass of untouched brandy in his hand, watching the room with a gaze that felt heavy and grey. He was 34. He had spent his 20s in the peninsula, commanding men who bled red into the mud, men who screamed for their mothers when the grape shot tore through their lines. He had returned to England to inherit a dukedom, a massive fortune, and a society that cared deeply about the precise width of a cravat. Tonight was supposed to be the night he selected a duchess. The mothers of the ton had paraded their daughters before him for 3 hours. They were flawless. Their hair was spun gold and polished jet. Their gowns cost more than a tenant farmer made in a lifetime. They laughed at his jokes before he finished them. They agreed with opinions he didn't even hold. They were mannequins, programmed to please. Charles felt completely, utterly alone in a room of 500 people. He was considering retreating to his study and locking the door when the rhythm of the room stuttered. It was a subtle shift at first. The waltz playing from the orchestra alcove seemed to lose its tempo. The first violinist was staring over his bow toward the entrance. Charles followed his gaze. The crowd near the doors was parting. It wasn't parting out of respect, the way they did for him. It was a physical recoil. People were stepping back, pulling their expensive silks out of the way, as if making room for something diseased. Through the gap, a woman was walking. Charles frowned, leaning forward slightly. She wore blue, or what used to be blue. The dress was a disaster. It was faded, lacking the structural support that current fashion demanded. But that wasn't what caught his eye. It was the massive, violent tear down the side of her skirt. Charles's eyes narrowed. He knew what accidental tears looked like. He had seen enough men catch themselves on thorns or bayonets. Accidental tears jagged and pulled. This was a clean, straight line. Someone had taken a blade to that fabric, and she had stitched it back together. The thick, dark thread crisscrossed the pale blue silk like a scar. It was ugly. It was defiant. Charles looked from the dress up to her face. She was pale, chalk white, and her chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid breaths. Her dark hair was scraped back severely. She was terrified. He could see the micro-expressions of panic tightening the corners of her eyes, yet she didn't stop walking. She didn't look down. She kept her chin lifted, walking straight into the center of a room that was actively tearing her to shreds with their whispers. Disgraceful. Is she mad? Someone fetch the guards. Surely she's an intruder. Charles scanned the crowd. He saw the sneers. He saw the older women hiding behind their fans, their eyes glittering with malice. He saw a particular group of women, a stern-faced matron and 2 girls in flawless pink silk, watching the girl in blue with a look of supreme, vicious satisfaction. Ah, Charles understood. He had spent years reading battlefields. He could read a drawing room just as easily. This was a targeted strike. Someone had put her in that dress. Someone wanted her destroyed in front of the entire world. He looked back at the girl. She was standing near the edge of the dance floor now, isolated. A 5-foot radius of empty space surrounded her. She was entirely alone. She was looking up at the chandelier, her jaw clamped so tight, Charles thought it might shatter. She was refusing to break. Charles felt something twist in his chest. It was a sharp, sudden jolt of recognition. He looked at the polished debutantes, the scheming mothers, the sneering lords. Then he looked at the girl wearing her ruin like a banner. She was the only real thing in the entire room. Charles set his brandy glass down on the side table. He gripped the wooden arms of his chair. The room was still buzzing with cruel murmurs. The orchestra had completely stopped playing. Charles stood up. The scrape of his heavy oak chair, pushing back against the marble floor, rang out like a musket shot. The sound cut through the whispers instantly. 500 heads snapped toward the dais. The Duke of Westmoreland had not stood for any woman all evening. He had received them seated. He had watched them dance seated. Now, he was standing. The silence that fell over the ballroom was absolute. It was thick, heavy, and panicked. People stopped breathing. Charles ignored them all. He buttoned his black evening coat with slow, deliberate precision. He stepped down from the dais. The crowd scrambled backward, parting for him, leaving a wide, clear path straight to the center of the room. He walked slowly. His boots clicked against the polished wood floor. He didn't look left or right. He kept his eyes locked on the girl in the torn blue silk. As he approached, he saw her flinch. She thought he was coming to throw her out. Her eyes, a striking stormy grey, met his. They were braced for the final blow. Charles stopped exactly 3 feet in front of her. He didn't speak immediately. He let the entire room watch. He let the matrons and the sneering lords see exactly where his attention was fixed. Then, Charles Parker, the Duke of Westmoreland, planted his feet, placed his right hand over his heart, and executed a perfect, deep, formal bow. It was a bow reserved for royalty. A collective gasp swept through the room. Somewhere near the back, a fan clattered loudly to the floor. Charles straightened. He looked into Beatrice's shocked, wide eyes. The terror in them was slowly giving way to utter confusion. "You honor my home with your presence," Charles said. His voice was deep, carrying easily in the dead silence of the room. It held no pity. It held absolute gravity. "I do not believe we have been formally introduced. I am Westmoreland." Beatrice's lips parted. She stared at him. She looked at his face, the faint, pale scar near his jaw, the dark, tired eyes that were currently blazing with an intense, quiet heat. She started, her voice cracking. She swallowed hard, forcing her vocal cords to work. "I am Beatrice Linfield, Your Grace." "Miss Linfield." Charles held out his white-gloved hand. The orchestra seems to have forgotten their duty. But if they remember it, may I have the honor of this dance? Charles's gloved hand remained extended. It didn't waver. The silence in the room had stretched so tight, it felt like the crystal drops on the chandelier might shatter from the tension. Beatrice looked at his hand. The white cotton was pristine. Her own hands were bare, the skin on her left thumb rough and peeling from a hot iron burn 3 days prior. She slowly lifted her arm. Her fingers trembled, just once, before she laid her palm against his. His grip was warm, solid, and completely unhesitating. Charles turned his head just a fraction of an inch toward the orchestra alcove. He did not raise his voice. He did not issue a command. He simply looked at the first violinist with a stare, forged in the mud of the Iberian Peninsula. The violinist swallowed hard, jammed his violin under his chin, and dragged his bow across the strings. It was a waltz, a slow, haunting piece that sounded almost melancholic. Charles pulled Beatrice into his arms. He did not hold her at arm's length, the way a man holds a partner he finds distasteful. He stepped in close. His right hand settled firmly on her waist, his thumb resting securely against her spine, right over the faded pink ribbon she had used as a makeshift corset string. "Look at me," Charles murmured. Beatrice realized she had been staring at his lapel. She forced her chin up. His eyes were not a warm brown. They were the color of dark, rich soil, flinty and exhausted, yet entirely focused on her. "They are going to stare," Charles said, stepping off on the first beat. He moved with a smooth, predatory grace that betrayed his military past. Let them. They have nothing better to do with their miserable lives. Beatrice followed his lead. The heavy wool of his coat brushed against the raw, frayed silk of her bodice. "You are ruining your own ball, Your Grace." "It was already ruined," Charles replied. He spun her gently, putting his own broad shoulders between her slashed hip and the majority of the staring crowd. It was a subtle maneuver, a tactical shield. "I have spent the last 3 hours listening to variations of the same conversation about the weather in Bath. I was contemplating setting fire to the curtains just for a change of scenery. You saved me the trouble." A harsh, breathy sound escaped Beatrice's throat. It took a second for her to realize it was a laugh. It sounded rusty. "I assure you, arson would have been less scandalous." "Perhaps." Charles's gaze dropped to the thick navy thread holding her skirt together. He didn't look away quickly, pretending he hadn't seen it like a polite gentleman would. He studied it. "Who wielded the shears?" Beatrice missed a step. Charles simply tightened his grip on her waist, carrying her smoothly through the stumble so no one else noticed. "You assume it was deliberate," she said softly. "I commanded infantry for 7 years, Miss Linfield. I know the difference between collateral damage and a targeted bayonet strike. That," he nodded toward her hip, "was an execution. So, who held the blade?" Beatrice looked over Charles's shoulder. As they rotated around the floor, the crowd blurred into a smear of jewels and silk. But one face stood out with razor clarity. Agatha. Her stepmother was standing near the pillars, her face completely drained of blood, her knuckles white where she gripped her fan. Harriet and Cecily flanked her, looking like frightened porcelain dolls. "My stepmother," Beatrice said. Her voice was flat, devoid of self-pity. "Lady Agatha Linfield." Charles followed her line of sight. He saw the older woman staring back at them. He catalogued the rigid posture, the panicked calculation in the woman's eyes. "Efficient," Charles noted dryly. "And the stitches?" "Mine. You didn't try to hide it. There was no hiding it." Beatrice looked back at him, her grey eyes hardening. The terror had burned off, leaving a clean, cold defiance in its wake. "I could either stay in my room and let her win, or I could come here and let her show the world exactly who she is." "I chose the latter." Charles's steps slowed just a fraction. He looked at her face, really looked at it. Beneath the severe hairstyle and the pinched pallor, there was a sharp, striking intelligence. There was no simpering, no manufactured vulnerability asking for a savior. She was a soldier bleeding out on the field, entirely prepared to die on her feet. He had expected a victim. He had found a veteran. And are you prepared for the fallout, Miss Linfield? Charles asked quietly. Because tomorrow, every drawing room in London will be discussing you. They will call me mad, Beatrice said, stating a fact. They will say I am a destitute beggar who lost her mind and broke into your home. They will pity my stepmother for having to manage me. They might, Charles agreed, unless I dictate otherwise. Beatrice frowned. Why are you doing this? Pity? I don't have enough energy for pity, Charles said flatly. The music began to swell toward its conclusion. I despise bullies, and I am utterly, deeply bored. You are the first person I have met tonight who is actually real. The waltz ended with a final, resonant chord from the cellos. Charles did not step back immediately. He kept his hand on her waist for 3 full seconds after the music died. He let the room register the intimacy of the lingering touch. Then he stepped back and offered a precise, formal bow. Beatrice curtsied. The raw edge of her silk pooled on the floor. The etiquette of the ballroom demanded he escort her back to her chaperone now. That meant walking her straight back to Agatha, handing her over to the enemy, and walking away. Charles held out his arm. Beatrice looked at it, then up at his face. "I am not taking you back to her," Charles said, reading her mind. "Come with me." Beatrice placed her hand on his forearm. He didn't lead her to the edges of the room. He walked her straight down the center of the ballroom, cutting through the crowd like a ship breaking ice, toward the raised dais where his own private table sat. The area reserved for the Duke, his family, and royalty. Whispers hissed through the air like steam escaping pipes. Charles ignored them. He pulled out a heavy mahogany chair, upholstered in red velvet. "Sit," he commanded softly. Beatrice sat. She was now elevated above the dance floor, visible to everyone. The slashed blue silk was stark against the dark red velvet of the chair. Charles signaled a passing footman with a sharp flick of his wrist. "Bring Miss Linfield a glass of champagne and a plate from the buffet. The roast fowl, not the pastries." He looked at Beatrice. "You look like you haven't eaten properly in a week." "I eat fine," she lied. Charles just raised an eyebrow and sat in the chair beside her. It took Agatha exactly 4 minutes to marshal her forces. Beatrice watched them cross the floor. Agatha moved with a terrifying, contained grace, her smile fixed firmly in place. Harriet and Cecily trailed behind her, looking nervously at the crowd. They were flanking her like infantry, supporting a general. "Brace yourself," Beatrice murmured, staring straight ahead. She didn't realize she had spoken aloud until Charles leaned slightly toward her. "Hold your ground," Charles replied, his voice a low, steady rumble. "Do not apologize for anything." Agatha reached the dais. She stopped at the bottom of the 2 short stairs. She did not look at Beatrice. She directed all her formidable charm upward toward the Duke. She sank into a deep, flawless curtsy. The girls mirrored her, a wave of pale pink silk. "Your Grace," Agatha said, her voice dripping with maternal distress. "I cannot express my profound apologies. I am thoroughly mortified." Charles took a sip of his brandy. He didn't offer them chairs. He didn't tell them to rise from their curtsies immediately, letting their thigh muscles burn for a few seconds before he finally nodded. "Lady Linfield, apologies for what?" Agatha stood, pressing her hand to her chest. She manufactured a look of deep, sorrowful pain. "For this intrusion. My stepdaughter, Beatrice. Her mind has been fragile since her dear father passed. She is prone to these episodes, delusions of grandeur, fits of destructive rebellion." Agatha finally turned her sorrowful gaze toward Beatrice. "Oh, Beatrice, my poor child. To take shears to your own gown in a fit of madness and then wander into the Duke's home. It breaks my heart to see you this way." It was a brilliant maneuver. Agatha wasn't angry. She was a victim of a tragic, mentally unstable ward. She was painting Beatrice not as a rebel, but as a lunatic. In high society, madness was a stain that never washed out. Beatrice felt the cold claw of panic grip her lungs. She opened her mouth, but the words stuck. How did she defend herself against pity? If she yelled, she proved Agatha right. If she wept, she proved Agatha right. Charles set his glass down. The soft clink of crystal against wood sounded loud. An episode, you say? Charles leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. He looked at Agatha with an expression of polite, clinical interest. She took shears to her own dress? I am afraid so, Your Grace, Agatha sighed. We try to keep sharp objects away from her, but... Fascinating, Charles interrupted smoothly. Because I was just admiring the cut. It is remarkably clean. The work of someone with a very steady hand, pulling the fabric taut before slicing. I would expect a frantic, mad episode to produce jagged tears. Much like Harriet's hem, actually. Harriet gasped and looked down. Her pink silk hem was perfectly fine, but the damage was done. She had flinched. Agatha's smile tightened. A tiny crack appeared in the porcelain mask. Madness takes many forms, Your Grace. Indeed it does, Charles said. He stood up slowly. He was a tall man, and standing on the dais, he towered over Agatha. The lazy, bored aristocrat vanished, replaced entirely by the military commander. For instance, I consider it sheer madness for a guardian to allow her ward to attend a public event in such a state. If Miss Linfield is as fragile as you claim, why was she not supervised? Why was she able to secure transport? Agatha swallowed. We left her in the care of the servants, Your Grace. She must have slipped out. So your staff is incompetent as well as your household management, Charles deduced aloud, his voice carrying easily to the nearest guests, who were pretending not to eavesdrop. Lady Linfield, I find your explanations lacking. Your Grace, I assure you, what I see... Charles cut across her again, his voice dropping in volume but increasing in lethal density, is a young woman who walked into my home with more courage in her little finger than the entirety of this room possesses. I see a dress that was deliberately sabotaged by someone terrified of being outshone. He looked at Harriet and Cecily. They shrank back from his gaze. He didn't even bother insulting them. His total lack of interest was devastating enough. Charles looked back at Agatha. Miss Linfield is my honored guest tonight. She will remain here for as long as she wishes. You, however, seem quite distressed. Perhaps the night air would benefit your nerves. The major domo can call for your carriage. It was an eviction. The Duke of Westmoreland was throwing Lady Agatha Linfield out of her ultimate triumph, publicly, and in front of the most powerful gossips in England. Agatha's face went mottled red, then bone white. She opened her mouth. She looked at the Duke's hard, unforgiving eyes. She realized with a sudden, sinking horror that he held all the power, and he was entirely willing to crush her with it. She turned to Beatrice. The mask dropped completely for a fraction of a second, revealing a hatred so pure it felt like a physical heat. Beatrice looked back. The fear was gone. She sat in the Duke's chair, holding the Duke's champagne, wearing her ruined dress. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She just looked at Agatha with the calm, flat eyes of a survivor watching the tide roll out. The seamstress was quite deliberate, stepmother, Beatrice said softly. But as you can see, the thread held. Agatha spun on her heel. Come, girls, she hissed. Harriet and Cecily scrambled after her, their pink silks rustling frantically as they practically fled the ballroom. Charles watched them go. He sat back down beside Beatrice. He picked up his brandy. Well, Charles said quietly, that was entirely too entertaining. Beatrice stared at the empty space where her stepmother had stood. Her hands began to shake again, the adrenaline crashing out of her system, leaving her hollow and cold. She set the champagne flute on the table before she dropped it. She is going to lock me in the cellar when I return, Beatrice whispered, the reality of her situation suddenly crashing down on her. The Duke's protection only extended to the property line. Charles looked at her shaking hands. He reached out and gently covered her hands with his own, pressing them flat against the table to stop the tremors. "No," Charles said. "She isn't." By 2 in the morning, the ball had dwindled to a slow, drunken crawl. Beatrice had not danced again. She hadn't needed to. She had sat beside the Duke for 3 hours. Important men had come to the table, initially seeking Charles's favor. But under Charles's silent, commanding gaze, they had bowed to Beatrice. Women who had laughed at her 3 hours ago now smiled nervously when they caught her eye. It was an illusion of power, Beatrice knew. It was borrowed armor. But it was intoxicating. "I must go," Beatrice said, standing up. Her legs felt heavy. The jagged slash on her hip had frayed further, the navy thread pulling against the fragile silk. Charles stood immediately. "I will have my carriage brought around." "That isn't necessary." "A hackney—" "Miss Linfield," Charles interrupted gently. "If you think I am sending you home in a hired carriage after tonight, you have severely misjudged my character. You will take my carriage. My footman will see you to your door." He didn't ask, he dictated. Beatrice was too exhausted to argue. Charles walked her to the foyer. The grand staircase was empty now, a stark contrast to the gauntlet it had been hours ago. At the door, the major domo, the same man who had debated throwing her out, bowed deeply and handed Beatrice a thick, fur-lined cloak. "The Duke's compliments, miss," the major domo said respectfully. Charles stepped out onto the portico with her. The night air was freezing, biting through her thin silk instantly, but the heavy fur cloak settled over her shoulders, smelling of cedar and Charles's shaving soap. A massive, gleaming black carriage with the Westmoreland crest in gold stood waiting. 4 matched black horses stamped their hooves in the cold, their breath pluming in the gaslight. 2 footmen in livery stood at attention. Beatrice turned to Charles. The shadows of the portico hid his eyes, highlighting the sharp angle of his jaw and the faint, pale scar. "Thank you," she said. It felt wholly inadequate. "I don't know why you did this, Your Grace. But thank you." Charles looked at her. The wind whipped a stray lock of dark hair across her cheek. She looked exhausted, battered, and undeniably beautiful. Not the manufactured porcelain beauty of the girls inside. She looked like something carved out of flint. "I did it because it was necessary," Charles said quietly. "And because I wanted to. Go home, Miss Linfield. Sleep. Tomorrow will be a very loud day." "Will she be waiting?" Beatrice asked, the dread creeping back into her throat. "I imagine so," Charles said. "But the dynamic has shifted. She knows I am watching. A bully only strikes when they think the victim is isolated. You are no longer isolated." He offered his hand. Beatrice took it. He didn't kiss her knuckles, he just squeezed her fingers firmly, a soldier offering strength to a comrade. He helped her into the carriage. The door shut with a solid, heavy thud. Beatrice sank back into the plush leather squabs. The carriage was incredibly warm, heated by copper bricks under the floorboards. She pulled the fur cloak tighter around herself. The carriage lurched forward, moving smoothly over the cobblestones. Beatrice stared out the window into the dark streets of London. The adrenaline had completely left her, leaving a deep, aching exhaustion in her bones. Yet, beneath the exhaustion, there was a tiny, hard spark of something new. Hope? No, hope was too fragile. It was realization. She had walked into the fire, and she hadn't burned. The ride to the Linfield townhouse in Bloomsbury took 20 minutes. When the carriage pulled up to the curb, the house was dark, save for one single glowing window on the ground floor. The parlor. Agatha was awake. The footman opened the door and handed Beatrice down. He escorted her up the steps and waited until she unlocked the front door with her heavy iron key. "Shall I wait to ensure you are settled, miss?" the footman asked, his eyes scanning the dark hallway. The Duke's orders were clearly strict. "No," Beatrice said, finding a scrap of courage. "I am fine, thank you." The footman bowed and returned to the carriage. The heavy wheels clattered away, leaving Beatrice alone in the suffocating silence of the house. She closed the front door. The lock clicked shut like a gunshot in the quiet hallway. She stood in the dark for a moment. She let the heavy fur cloak slide from her shoulders, pooling on the floorboards. She was back in the ruined blue dress. She was back in her reality. She walked toward the sliver of light spilling from beneath the parlor door. She pushed the door open. The fire had burned down to red embers. Agatha sat in a high-backed armchair by the hearth. She was still in her gown, her hair perfectly coiffed, but the mask of society composure was gone. In the dim red light, she looked older, sharper. Her eyes were fixed on Beatrice, burning with a quiet, lethal fury. There was no yelling. Agatha didn't throw things. That was not how she fought. "Do you think you have won?" Agatha asked softly. The words hissed through the quiet room. "Do you think because the Duke felt a fleeting moment of pity for a beggar in a ripped dress, that you are suddenly my equal?" Beatrice stopped in the center of the room. She looked at her stepmother. She remembered the fear she had felt standing on the stairs at Aylesbury House. She searched for it now. It wasn't there. "I don't think I am your equal, stepmother," Beatrice said. Her voice was remarkably steady, sounding loud and clear in the small room. Agatha sneered. "At least you have maintained a sliver of sense. He used you to make a spectacle. He will forget you by tomorrow." Beatrice looked down at the heavy navy stitches holding her skirt together. She traced the rough thread with her thumb. "I don't think I am your equal," Beatrice repeated, raising her eyes to meet Agatha's directly. "I think you are terrified because you realize I am better than you, and as of tonight, so does the rest of London." Agatha shot up from her chair, her hands curling into claws, her face twisting into something ugly and feral. Beatrice didn't flinch. She didn't step back. She just stood there. Waiting, Agatha froze. She saw the lack of fear. She saw the quiet, cold defiance. The realization hit her, hard and suffocating. The girl she had kept locked in the sewing room was gone. Without another word, Beatrice turned her back on her stepmother, walked out of the parlor, and began the long climb up the stairs to her room under the eaves. The battle was over. The war had just begun. The morning came bleeding through the attic window, grey and unforgiving. Beatrice woke to the sound of rain lashing the glass. Her body felt like it had been beaten with wooden dowels. The muscles in her back screamed as she sat up. She looked at the foot of her narrow bed. The blue silk dress lay exactly where she had left it. In the stark daylight, the navy stitches looked even more grotesque, the fabric wrinkled and dead. She didn't linger. She washed her face with freezing water from the porcelain pitcher, dressed in her most faded, practical grey wool day dress, and went downstairs. The house was completely silent. It was barely 6 in the morning. Even the servants were just beginning to stir. When she reached the kitchen, Mrs. Higgins, the cook, wouldn't meet her eyes. The older woman was furiously kneading dough, her shoulders hunched. "Morning, Mrs. Higgins," Beatrice said. Mrs. Higgins swallowed. She gestured with a flour-caked hand toward the scullery corner. A heavy wooden bucket sat on the stone flagstones. Next to it was a stiff-bristled brush and a block of raw, caustic lye soap. Agatha stood in the doorway leading to the servants' stairs. She wore a pristine morning gown of dark plum, holding a cup of tea. She looked rested. She looked deeply, terribly calm. "The scullery maid has been dismissed," Agatha said. The steam from her tea curled around her face. Her wages were an unnecessary expense. Since you have made it clear you wish to operate outside the boundaries of a respectable daughter, you will no longer be treated as one. You will earn your keep. Start with the kitchen floors, then the front steps. Beatrice looked at the bucket. Then she looked at Agatha. Agatha took a sip of her tea. "You thought society would save you. You thought the Duke's little stunt meant something. But he is in Mayfair, drinking his coffee, and you are here. And you will always be here." Beatrice didn't argue. She didn't cry. The exhaustion was too absolute. She walked over to the bucket, rolled up her sleeves to the elbows, and dropped to her knees on the cold, damp stone. The lye soap burned. It was a harsh, chemical fire that bit into the small cuts on her hands, peeling the skin from her knuckles. She scrubbed the flagstones. The grey water sloshed over the rims of the bucket, soaking her skirt. Agatha watched her for 10 minutes, savouring the silence, before finally turning and walking upstairs. Beatrice worked for 3 hours. Her knees went numb. Her lower back burned with a dull, sickening ache. By 9 o'clock, the kitchen floor was done, and she had moved to the front hallway. She was scrubbing the marble near the front door, her hands raw and bleeding slightly into the soapy water when the heavy brass knocker sounded. It wasn't a polite tap. It was a sharp, aggressive thud that rattled the hinges. Beatrice froze. The butler, Mr. Franks, hurried out of the parlour, straightening his waistcoat. He gave Beatrice a look of profound discomfort. "Out of the way, Miss Beatrice. Quickly." Beatrice gathered her bucket and brush, dragging them toward the shadow of the staircase. She didn't have time to disappear completely before Mr. Franks opened the door. The rain was still falling, a steady London drizzle. Standing on the top step, completely ignoring the weather, was Charles Parker. He was not dressed for a morning call. He wore tall leather riding boots, splashed with mud, a heavy dark greatcoat, and no hat. He looked large, dangerous, and entirely out of place on the Linfield porch. "Your Grace?" Mr. Franks stammered, bowing so deeply he nearly hit his head on the doorknob. "Aye. We did not expect. Lady Linfield is not receiving." "I am not here for Lady Linfield," Charles said. His voice was low, cutting through the butler's panic like a blade. He didn't wait to be invited inside. He stepped over the threshold, forcing Mr. Franks to scramble backward. Charles's dark eyes swept the hallway. They bypassed the expensive vases and the gilded mirrors. They locked immediately onto the dark corner under the stairs. He saw the grey wool dress. He saw the wet, soapy skirts clinging to the floor. He saw the bucket, the scrub brush, and Beatrice's bright red, raw hands. The temperature in the hallway seemed to plummet by 10 degrees. Charles did not look shocked. He looked like a soldier who had just found the enemy's weakness. A muscle in his jaw twitched, tight and rigid. Footsteps clattered on the landing above. Agatha, having heard the commotion, hurried down the stairs. She stopped dead halfway down when she saw the massive, imposing figure of the Duke in her foyer. "Your Grace!" Agatha gasped, her hands flying to her throat in manufactured shock. "Whatever is the matter, you are soaked. Mr. Franks, take His Grace's coat." "Do not touch my coat," Charles said. The butler instantly withdrew his hand. Charles didn't look at Agatha. He walked slowly, deliberately, toward the shadows under the stairs. He stopped in front of Beatrice. She was still kneeling, one hand clutching the wet bristles of the brush. She looked up at him, her grey eyes wide, her chest rising and falling quickly. "Get up," Charles said softly. "My hands are dirty," Beatrice whispered. It was a stupid, senseless thing to say, but her brain had entirely short-circuited. Charles didn't care. He reached down, grasped her upper arms, and hauled her to her feet. He did it gently, but with absolute, immovable force. When she was standing, he looked at her hands. The cracked skin, the angry red chemical burns from the lye. He finally turned to look at Agatha on the stairs. "A scullery maid?" Charles asked. His voice was incredibly calm. It was the deadliest sound Beatrice had ever heard. Agatha's face paled. She was being punished, Your Grace. She was entirely insubordinate last night. A guardian must maintain discipline in her own home. It is a family matter." "A family matter?" Charles repeated the words, as if tasting something rotten. He kept one hand firmly wrapped around Beatrice's arm, anchoring her. "Lady Linfield, I spent the morning at my club. Do you know what the men were talking about?" Agatha gripped the banister. "I cannot imagine, Your Grace. They were talking about a woman who had the sheer, unmitigated spine to walk into a room of vipers wearing her own destruction, and how she completely silenced them." Charles took a step toward the stairs, pulling Beatrice with him. "They were also talking about you. About a woman so remarkably insecure, she had to take a blade to a dress because she knew, definitively, that she could not compete on a level field." Agatha's mouth opened and closed. No sound came out. "You thought I would forget by morning," Charles said. "You thought my protection was a parlor trick. You are a very stupid woman." He turned to Beatrice. "Where are your things?" My things?" Beatrice asked, her mind reeling. "Your clothes, your belongings. Where are they?" "In my room." Charles looked at Mr. Franks. "Go upstairs. Pack Miss Linfield's trunk. Bring it down immediately." "You cannot do this!" Agatha shrieked, finally finding her voice. She hurried down the remaining stairs. "She is my ward. You have no legal right. This is kidnapping, Your Grace. I will call the magistrate." Charles released Beatrice's arm and stepped directly into Agatha's path. He towered over her, his broad shoulders blocking the hallway. "Call him," Charles suggested, his voice a lethal purr. "Call the magistrate. Call the constables. And while they are here, I will have my solicitors audit the Linfield estate accounts. I will have them look very closely at how a viscount's daughter ended up scrubbing floors while her stepmother purchases French silk. I will ruin you in the courts, Lady Linfield. I will freeze your credit. I will buy your debts, and I will personally see to it that you do not have enough copper to buy a loaf of bread. Do you understand me?" Agatha stared at him. The sheer, overwhelming violence in his tone broke her. She shrank back, her hands trembling. Mr. Franks appeared on the landing, dragging the battered leather trunk down the stairs with surprising speed. Charles turned back to Beatrice. He didn't ask if she wanted to go. He just picked up the heavy wool cloak Agatha had left draped over a chair and wrapped it around Beatrice's trembling shoulders, covering her wet dress. "Come," Charles said. He didn't wait for her to walk. He placed a hand on the small of her back and guided her out the front door, into the rain, and straight into his waiting carriage. Beatrice was not taken to Aylesbury House. She was taken to a modest, impeccably tasteful townhouse in Mayfair, owned by Lady Honoria Sterling, Charles's widowed aunt. Lady Honoria was a woman forged of iron and dry wit. She took one look at Beatrice's raw hands and wet dress, ordered a hot bath, and told her nephew to sit in the parlor and behave himself. For 2 days, Beatrice slept. She ate hot soup. She let a maid apply soothing salve to her cracked knuckles. The sudden absence of fear was entirely disorienting. She kept waiting for the trap door to open beneath her. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, She was sitting in Lady Honoria's small glass conservatory. The rain had stopped, and pale sunlight filtered through the panes, warming the damp earth of the potted ferns. She wore a simple, beautiful gown of dark green merino wool that Honoria had provided. She heard the heavy, measured tread of boots on the stone path before the door opened. Charles stepped inside. He had lost the mud and the greatcoat. He was dressed flawlessly in charcoal grey, his cravat tied with severe precision. But his eyes were exactly the same, tired, sharp, and entirely focused on her. He didn't sit in the wrought-iron chair opposite her. He stood near a large fern, watching her face. "Your aunt has been very kind," Beatrice said softly, breaking the silence. "My aunt is a terror, but she respects a survivor," Charles replied. He crossed his arms. "Your hands are healing." "They are. Thank you." Beatrice looked down at her lap. "But we must speak of reality, Your Grace. I cannot stay here indefinitely. I have no money, and I have effectively burned the only bridge I had, no matter how rotten it was. I need to find employment, perhaps as a governess or a companion." Charles let out a harsh, brief sound. It wasn't quite a laugh. "A governess? You think I pulled you out of that house to watch you raise someone else's spoiled children? What else is there?" Beatrice challenged, her chin lifting. "You saved me from the lye soap. I am grateful, deeply. But society does not run on gratitude. It runs on capital, and I have none. I am a scandal." "You are a sensation," Charles corrected. "Agatha tried to spin her tale, but my aunt made 3 morning calls yesterday. She casually mentioned the lye soap. The ton loves a villain, Beatrice. They love Agatha's cruelty because it makes them feel morally superior, and they love you because you survived it. You are currently the most interesting woman in London." "Fads fade," Beatrice said bluntly. "They do." Charles finally moved. He walked over and sat in the chair across from her. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, invading her space with his intense, grounding presence. "Which is why we are going to make it permanent." Beatrice stopped breathing. She stared at him. "I told you at the ball, I despise the performative nature of my life," Charles said. His voice was low, stripped of any aristocratic polish. It was the voice of a man in the trenches. "I am expected to marry. I am expected to choose a woman who will smile, host dinners, and pretend I am not hollow inside. I don't want that." He reached out and gently took her right hand. He didn't kiss it. He traced the fading red burn marks on her knuckles with his thumb. "I spent years fighting a war that took everything from me," Charles said quietly. "I came back to a world that felt like cardboard. Nothing was real. Until you walked into my ballroom in a ruined dress, holding your chin up while 100 people tried to crush you." He looked up from her hand, meeting her eyes. "I don't want a porcelain doll, Beatrice. I want a partner who knows what it means to bleed and keep walking. I want the woman who stitched her own destruction together and wore it like a crown." Beatrice's throat was agonizingly tight. "Charles." It was the first time she had used his name. It tasted dangerous. "You don't know me. You know my survival instincts. Then let me learn the rest," Charles said. His grip on her hand tightened, warm and absolute. "Marry me. Let me give you the protection of my name, the weight of my title, and the keys to every door that was ever slammed in your face. And in return, you give me something real." It wasn't a declaration of poetic, fiery love. It was better. It was a foundation. It was a promise of mutual respect, forged in the understanding of their shared, invisible scars. Beatrice looked at his face. She saw the pale scar on his jaw. She felt the heavy, steady beat of his pulse where his thumb rested against her wrist. She had spent 5 years trying to make herself small enough to survive Agatha's house. She looked at Charles Parker, and she realized he was offering her the entire world and demanding she take up space in it. "They will say you married a scullery maid," Beatrice whispered, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. Charles's eyes flashed with a dark, predatory humor. "Let them say whatever they please. They will say it while bowing to you." Beatrice took a slow, deep breath. The scent of damp earth and ferns filled her lungs. She squeezed his hand back. "All right," Beatrice said. "Checkmate." The wedding of Charles Parker, Duke of Westmoreland, to Miss Beatrice Linfield took place exactly 1 month later at St. George's, Hanover Square. It was the most highly anticipated event of the decade. The pews were packed with the highest echelons of the ton, shoulder to shoulder in silks and velvets, whispering furiously. Beatrice stood in the vestibule, waiting for the organ to begin. Lady Honoria stood beside her, adjusting her veil. Beatrice was not wearing ice blue silk. She wore ivory satin. It was not heavily jeweled, nor was it dripping with lace. It was structurally flawless, the seams invisible, the cut severe and breathtakingly elegant. It demanded attention, not through ostentation, but through absolute perfection. "Nervous?" Honoria asked gruffly. "No," Beatrice answered truthfully. The heavy wooden doors of the church were slightly ajar, letting in the brisk autumn air. Outside, a small commotion caught Beatrice's attention. Standing at the bottom of the stone steps, attempting to argue with the Duke's massive, stone-faced security detail, was Agatha Linfield. Harriet and Cecily hovered behind her, looking miserable in out-of-season muslins. Agatha's credit had dried up instantly after the incident at the Linfield house. When word spread that the Duke was personally auditing the late Viscount's accounts, creditors had panicked. The carriage had been repossessed. The French silk bills were called in. Agatha was functionally ruined. She was trying to push past a footman. "I am the bride's mother. You cannot deny me entry." Beatrice watched her. For 5 years, that woman's voice had made Beatrice's blood run cold. Now it just sounded thin. Pathetic. Beatrice stepped forward, moving out of the shadows of the vestibule and into the light of the doorway. Agatha saw her. The older woman stopped struggling. She stared up the steps at the ivory satin, the flawless veil, the cold, composed face of the girl she had tried to destroy. Agatha's mouth worked, but no sound came out. The realization finally sank into her bones, heavy and permanent. The girl was untouchable. Beatrice didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply gave Agatha a slow, microscopic nod of acknowledgement, an executioner lowering the blade, and stepped back inside the church. The organ roared to life. Beatrice walked down the aisle alone. She didn't need anyone to give her away. She belonged to herself. She walked past the staring faces, past the whispers that were no longer cruel, but laced with awe and envy. She kept her eyes fixed entirely on the end of the aisle. Charles was waiting for her at the altar. He stood tall, immaculate in his dark, formal coat. When he saw her, the hard, military lines of his face softened. The exhaustion in his dark eyes vanished, replaced by a quiet, burning reverence. Beatrice reached him. He held out his hand. The white glove was gone. His hand was bare, warm, and real. She placed her bare hand in his. As they turned to face the altar, Beatrice reached into the hidden pocket, sewn into the seam of her immaculate ivory gown. Her fingers brushed against a tiny, rough object. It was a small, 2-inch strip of pale blue silk, held together by a thick, ugly navy stitch. She kept it as a reminder, not of the cruelty she had suffered, but of the exact moment she had refused to break. Charles felt her shift. He looked down, then leaned in, his lips brushing the edge of her ear. "Are you ready, Your Grace?" he whispered. Beatrice looked at the man who had seen her at her absolute worst and decided she was exactly what he wanted. She tightened her grip on his hand, stepping firmly into the light. "I have been ready my entire life," she said, and the Duke smiled. "If you loved seeing Beatrice flip the script and win the ultimate game of power, hit that like button right now." Beatrice proved that sometimes your greatest ruin is actually your strongest armor. What was your favorite moment? The ballroom showdown, or Charles dragging her out of that kitchen? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to share this story with your friends who love a smart, fierce heroine, and subscribe to the channel with notifications on so you never miss another epic romance. Until next time, keep your head up and your stitches strong.